When it comes to the national defense, the U.S. Constitution specifically grants Congress the power to provide and maintain a Navy, whereas it is limited to raising and supporting armies through appropriations of only 2 years. While the U.S. Constitution provides a means for military power to defend the nation, it also reflects a concern regarding the establishment of a permanent military force. Welcome to Brungart Law's Lanyap, where we provide a little extra perspective through conversations. I'm Reese Brungart, your host. I enjoy engaging with experienced, knowledgeable, and passionate individuals for the opportunity it affords to enrich our understanding of the world through their eyes. The more we learn, the more likely we can become better versions of ourselves, guide others towards the same, and perhaps have a little fun along the way. Today's guest is Dr. Thomas Mahnken, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, also Senior Research Professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and a scholar and practitioner of strategy and defense policy with extensive experience across academia, the Department of Defense, and the U.S. Navy Reserve. Welcome to the program, Dr. Mahnken.
It's my pleasure. Glad to be with you.
Well, again, thank you for joining us, and we'll hop right into this. You've served in academia, government, and policy research. How and where and why did your journey begin in that way, and what drew you to the field of strategy and national security?
Look, that's a wonderful question, and it takes me back. It takes me back to my hometown of Del Mar, California, my beautiful seaside town north of San Diego. Place I couldn't afford to live now, but fortunately had parents with foresight to settle there. It brings me back to a time where I was born 20 years after the end of World War II, and the legacy of World War II was very much alive in my parents' generation. My father was a World War II veteran, Marine aviator. My mom had worked for the Navy during World War II. And so from a very early age, I was interested in history, read a lot of history, had history read to me. I was interested in military affairs, and that interest just continued to grow throughout my childhood, and into college and into graduate school. And maybe, so unusually, at least for a lot of my male cohort friends, I chose a path fairly early on and have just kind of followed that path throughout my career.
And if you don't mind me asking, where did you go to school, university?
Yeah, so I attended the University of Southern California, and for several reasons. One of them being that they had a school of international relations, a really good school of international relations. And at the time, they also had an outstanding defense and strategic studies program. And I can recall, sitting in a classroom. I can visualize it in my head for the very first class I took in strategic studies. And I remember the books that we read. I remember opening those books, and I just remember entering a whole new world, a world of history, a world of leaders, and a world of ideas. And my time as an undergrad really kindled my love of international affairs and strategic studies that I then, went on to study in greater depth in grad school at Johns Hopkins for my master's, then went off, worked for a little bit, and then came back to get my PhD at Hopkins, and really have been teaching there for quite some time after.
Out of curiosity, and just deviating momentarily, how would you compare similarities and differences between your time as an undergrad and what there in California, and what you perceive as the experience for the undergrads at Johns Hopkins?
Oh, it's a great question. And I can't answer it directly because these days I don't teach undergraduates.
Okay.
I've actually never taught undergraduates. But I will say I have, or I had two in my household. Now one's graduated and the other's still So I can connect to today's undergraduates through them. But I think for me, it was a wonderful place, a wonderful time. Um, LA in the 1980s was great. My dorm was actually built for the 1984 Olympic Village, so
Oh, wow.
it was brand new. Although it's kind of a pale shadow of today's college dorms and apartments. I look at my daughter's apartment at West Virginia University, and it's not only better than every university apartment I lived in, but probably the two or three I lived in after graduating college. But it was a wonderful time. I the contrast I would draw is well, two contrasts. Number one, there was a real kind of vibrant, vital conversation around national security in Southern California in the 1980s, and unfortunately, that's no longer the case. And there used to be much more vibrant conversations about national security across the country. And unfortunately, what's happened, particularly since the end of the Cold War, is that's really receded. It's receded to to the northeast, to the Acela corridor, to the swamp, whatever you want to call it. And unfortunately, in all too many colleges and universities, and in civic life in too many cities across the country, people just aren't talking about these issues. So that's one, I think, one big contrast. But as to the student experience, I think students today, by and large, and I'll say undergraduate and graduate, I think a lot of them have a much more utilitarian sense of education than certainly I did. I mean, I was eventually going to get a job, and I was
Yes.
interested in that. But I find more common today just this utilitarian notion of, okay, well, what is this going to do for me? I also find a lot of today's students to be looking for much more guidance than I ever expected, let alone got in college or graduate school. And yeah, I think that's that's a concern of mine.
Do you think that could be attributed to, and then I'll pull us out of the rabbit hole,
Sure.
to the fact information is much more readily available and accessible today, that people, I guess, are inherently moving towards seeking guidance as opposed to before? You couldn't get all the information as quickly, and so you made decisions based on what you had at hand.
I think that's one dimension of it. I think more broadly, kids, and I mean kids, growing up are more sheltered from having to make decisions, take risks of various sorts, right? And of course, some of that's good, right?
Yes.
But on the other hand, look, I say fairly unusually for my friends growing up, both of my parents worked. So I guess, today I would be called a latchkey kid. I didn't really think about it that way. What I thought about was I walked home from school, I sat down, I did my homework, and then with my friends, we went out and explored the canyon that was a block behind our house, rode skateboards or bikes, and then at the appropriate time determined by the placement of the sun in the sky, I made my way home and had dinner. And I did that from kind of elementary school on, and that's a very different existence than I think a lot of kids today. I think probably maybe in some jurisdictions my parents would be arrested for childhood neglect or something like that. But I think I benefited from it greatly. yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I could talk about, growing up in San Diego and as a teenager being really close to the Mexican border and the ability to go across borders pretty readily. But I won't go too far into that.
Yes, you've opened up potentially a whole new topic. Anyway,
Senator, I have absolutely no recollection of anything.
for those unfamiliar with your work, what would you say ties together your experiences across the military, academia, the Pentagon, and now the think tank, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments?
Yeah. Well, I think, look, somebody far wiser than I many years ago uh, gave me a very powerful way of thinking about a life or a career, and it's one that I took to heart and I advise people about all the time. And the basic notion is, look, that living your life is like walking down a hallway, and you should probably enjoy that walk. That walk in and of itself should be fulfilling. Now, as you walk down the hallway at various times, different doors open up. And so the big decisions in life are about, do you go through those doors or not? And it's not about, there's a door that's locked. Can I pick the lock? Can I blow open the door? Can I get a drywall saw and create a door where none exists? It's about making decisions as opportunities present themselves. And that's the way I've tried to live my life. So that walking down the hall, I've engaged in research, studies. I've investigated topics that I find interesting, and on certain occasions, different doors have opened up. As you say, there was a door. I tried to go through a door of joining the Navy Reserve. First time that door was locked. I kept walking. And then the next time it was open, and I went through it. Got an opportunity to teach at the Naval War College, which was an institution that I'd always regarded very highly. I went through that door, never regretted it. It was an amazing experience. Got an opportunity to teach at SICE for what I thought was going to be a year, and that was over 20 years ago. I decided to go through that door. Got a call literally sort of out of the blue from the Pentagon, which led to a job there. I decided to go through that. And then similarly in 2016, was sort of headhunted to come to lead CSBA. Those are the doors that I went through. There were a bunch of other doors that I decided not to go through. And I have absolutely no regrets about not going through those doors. I also haven't spent a lot of time. I'd be lying if I said I spent no time, but I haven't spent a lot of time trying to, unlock those locked doors or blow open the doors or create new doors. So that's one thing. But I think another thing tying everything together is a very broad but basic notion of public service. I think one of the things that fulfills me is looking at questions, answering questions that have a sort of a public impact. It's not, although I appreciate, the development of knowledge for knowledge's sake, that's just never been where my heart is. So it's being able to do things that serve the public good, in some way, maybe
Yes.
directly, maybe less directly, maybe immediately, maybe less immediately. And again, that's changed over time. But those are the threads that have kind of tied things together.
You mentioned your time, the Navy Reserve door locked, and then eventually it opened. Beginning with that, and whether it was as eventually a Navy officer in the field, in the classroom as an educator, or you were informing decision makers, numerous times you operated among uncertainty. From your perspective, how should decision making be undertaken when information is incomplete or the risks are ambiguous? And especially for people nowadays who have information readily available and in great quantities and immediately, and sometimes they want to have like a complete picture before making a decision. How would you recommend they undertake decisions?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I would say that, uncertainty is inherent in life. And you're right that there is more, data available, more information available. But of course, some of that's authoritative. A lot of it is questionable. Some of it is actually just kind of like, laughable or farcical. So just the fact that there's more information doesn't drive down uncertainty. If anything, I think in some cases it drives it up. So I think the first thing is to recognize that uncertainty is a part of life, and that oftentimes a good faith, decent decision in the face of uncertainty is better than no decision whatsoever. I think, the folks who I've worked for over the years, whom I respect the most, and I think about former Secretary Bob Gates, who I served as one example of that. The way he puts it is, like, usually all the easy decisions are made below a senior decision maker. Like the really easy decisions have already been taken. So the ones that are left to senior decision makers are always kind of difficult and rife with uncertainty. So you gotta live with that. The other thing I would say too is that I believe very strongly in acting to gain information, right? So what you implied with your question, I think it's quite frequent, is to sit back and just gather more information or wait for more information to emerge. Sometimes that can be wise, but oftentimes you can act to gain more information. How is a particular country likely to respond to something we do? Well, okay, you could try doing it in a certain way and see if it has a good impact or a not so good impact. So I believe really strongly in being active in the face of uncertainty.
As a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, and now your current role, head of a think tank, what do you propose as an organizational culture that best enables the translation of sound policy into productive, actionable results?
Yeah, look, first, thanks for the question, because I am a person who believes strongly in organizational culture. I actually think organizational culture is the Rosetta Stone, the secret decoder ring for understanding so much of what goes on. And I'm tremendously fortunate. Again, this is back to that walking down the hallway and doors opening. I did a piece of research fairly early in my career that essentially was looking at the organizational culture of the U.S. military and the different services. And I was able to do it at a time in my career where I actually had time to focus on things for a long time. And I've benefited from those insights ever since. So first, organizational culture is huge. You should start by recognizing that. And organizations, even nominally like organizations can have very different cultures. So in my current job, I deal a lot with different defense firms. And I'll just say, and it's without prejudice to any particular firm, the cultures of nominally similar firms are just very different, and in ways, in kind of measurable ways. So it's really important. But to your question about what type of culture best allows one to translate policy into productive, actionable results. Look, I look back at the culture that existed, at least during my time, in the Pentagon, in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It's also the culture that I say we have here at CSBA, and that is a culture. This may sound actually a little bit ironic, but it's a culture that really values individuals and their talents and their contributions. So it's a culture that puts skilled, talented individuals at the forefront. So, in policy, I would say about 80% of the value of that organization when I was there was produced at the action officer level, which is the entry level.
Yep.
And I say that as somebody who was rungs above that. The job of me, those between me and the action officers, was just to add a little bit more value to what the action officers were producing, to bar the door to make sure that they got into the meetings and things like that. So it really, and policy, at least at that time, was just an outstanding, very high performance organization. And at CSBA, similarly, I mean, it's about our researchers, and it's about their work and putting them in the best position possible to do their work, to shine, and to move forward. That's just, that's just key.
I'll come back to your reference to your researchers, your people, so to say. It's the people that count, the action officer. Organizational culture, it struck me while you were talking and you highlighted the Pentagon. And I'm going to go out on a limb here. But thinking of under the former Soviet Union and the organizational culture they had regarding their space program, obviously the way they approach things in a communist environment was much different than we did at that time. Yet they were able to produce actionable results. I mean, they got into space before we did. So how would you comment on that? Can you have successful cultures, organizations that are operating on completely opposite ideologies?
Oh, absolutely. Look, the Soviets had a way of mobilizing talent and directing it to national objectives. The Russians still do. The Chinese also do that, and they do it in a particular way. So, one of the things that the Soviets did as part of their missile program, their space program, the nuclear program, they were able to identify the best and the brightest. They kind of hived them off into these science cities that were basically hidden from the public and actually not even on maps. So they concentrated talent, and they created, when they were successful, they created ecosystems where I will say many of the rules of the communist Soviet Union didn't apply or weren't as strictly enforced. So that's one model. That's a very different model from the way the U.S. does it, right? The way the U.S. does it is, and we've done it so most successfully, is for the government to provide incentives, and then to let the free market do its business. And then the government also can serve to provide a demand signal where there isn't normally a demand signal. But you talked about space. My dad worked on the Atlas missile program.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that was an amazing achievement. And that was another mobilization of talent, but that was done in a very different way. I think that was done in a very democratic, capitalist sort of way. And given the historical results, I have difficulty betting against our system when properly employed.
Returning to your researchers, organizational culture. What would you comment on the importance of diversity, and especially in the sense that in some ways it can be, I think the quest for diversity can sometimes miss the mark in the way it is approached or executed. But a lot of times it doesn't, quite the opposite. It's achieving its aims. But regardless, speak to us a little bit about diversity within an organization and how it creates this kind of effective culture.
Yeah. Look, it's a great question, again, I'm going to address diversity in all of its manifestations. I
Yes.
think, unfortunately, in recent years, that word has been boiled down to a synonym for ethnicity or genetics or something like that, and I think that's a shame. Again, reflecting a little bit on my childhood, I grew up in from one perspective a very diverse neighborhood. I had and I kind of like stumble over this formulation because it doesn't come naturally to me. But like I had friends who were Hispanic, friends who were Asian American, friends who were Black, and I stumble over that because they were all my friends.
Hmm.
And in the neighborhood and the environment I grew up in, they were all just friends.
Yes.
Where there wasn't diversity in the neighborhood where I grew up was in expectations. There was no diversity of expectations. You were going to get an education. Doesn't matter what color your skin is, doesn't matter what your parents did, you're going to get an education, and you're going to go, and that might be community college, it might be state, it might be an Ivy League, it might be anything. But my high school, public high school, you were going to go get an education. And so in some ways, I definitely approve of a lack of diversity when it comes to expectations, high expectations. But I think when it comes to a diversity of experiences, a diversity of expertise, skills, personality types, I think that's extraordinarily important. And taking a multidisciplinary approach in kind of the broadest sense of things, I think is tremendously important. No single approach has all the answers. So I've actually been quite fortunate. Whether at the Naval War College, I taught in the Department of Strategy. We had political scientists, we had economists, we had historians, we had regional specialists. One of the things that made us really strong. At SICE, in the Strategic Studies program at SICE, similarly, you have people with all sorts of different academic backgrounds, professional backgrounds. We have a number of professors who don't hold PhDs, but they had very distinguished government careers as practitioners. Same thing here at CSBA. We have people with military backgrounds, with different academic backgrounds, different policymaking backgrounds. And that really enriches the work that we do. And it puts us at a competitive advantage, to be honest, against, I just say a group of historians.
Yes.
Or, God help us, a group of political scientists. Yeah.
And I think one can also take the concept of diversity and really personalize it, that as an individual, one would need diversity of thought internally, especially when you're going to be approaching challenges or issues. And in that regard, when it comes to strategic decision making, there's often a tension between ideals and practical necessities. How do you reconcile that tension? And I'm not asking you personally, but in this realm, how does one reconcile that tension? And what advice do you offer to leaders trying to do the same?
Yeah. Well, I'll tackle that on two different levels. Because there are ideals, as in I'll just say Platonic ideal types, and then there's ideals in terms of values. And let me kind of take it on in both
Okay.
ways. So I mean, the Platonic ideal, again, the people who believe, again, they fall in love with a particular approach or a particular answer or a particular framework, and everything gets fitted into that. Um, I worry about people like that when they're exposed to reality for so long, because I think a background, in a particular approach, a particular discipline is helpful, but the world doesn't really adhere to any particular approach. So that's one take on it. On the other hand, when we talk about values, look, I think values are tremendously important, and in the end, you have to live with your actions and your inaction, and so you need to act in accord with your values. Something I used to say a lot when I was in the Pentagon, when members of my team were kind of hesitant to speak truth to power, I would always say, look, we don't live in Stalin's Russia. What's the worst thing that's going to happen to you? You're not going to be marched to the basement of the Lubyanka and shot in the head, right? What's the worst thing? And as a practical matter, at that time, the worst thing was somebody wasn't going to listen to you, or might say something kind of brusque to you.
Yes.
So in that type of environment, live the courage of your convictions. And I still believe that that's the way to go about things.
Turning this around briefly for a moment, it reminded me of a question I've always had when it comes to presidential candidate debates. And I've always been intrigued why the question has never been posed to any person pursuing that office. Why would you want to have your finger on the nuclear trigger? Because at the end of the day, if it ever comes to that, you will have to make that decision. And I'm curious, they've never really put someone on the hot spot about that. The closest they came to, I think, was the debate between Hillary Clinton and current President Donald Trump. And they were asking about executing a preemptive strike, and they both kind of danced around the issue. Do you think it's important for candidates to be challenged in that regard?
I think it's useful. I think the point you make is a really good one. I think it's very useful for candidates. Well, first, there's the basic question of like, why do you want to do this anyway? I mean, frankly.
Well, yeah, but we tend to associate our presidency with this altruistic office, but the reality is it's much more than that.
No, that's absolutely right. My point was just like, why would anybody want to run for elective office these days? It just seems so ungratifying. But your point is a good one, and the historical track record, is that after being elected, president after being elected, before being inaugurated, then after being inaugurated. Presidents are confronted with tremendous responsibilities, and you point to one of the gravest responsibilities, and presidents take those responsibilities extremely seriously. And in some cases, it has led presidents to imagine, the abolition of nuclear weapons. In other cases, it's led presidents to take very seriously the need to defend the United States against a hostile attack. There is a sense of responsibility that comes upon a president after he's elected. And I served a president, George W. Bush, after 9/11. I entered government a number of years after 9/11. But that experience of having failed to protect the United States against attack haunted that administration until its end. And I think, even went even went beyond, that administration. So it would be good to, to ask candidates to try to inoculate them a little bit on this. But I think what you talked about is extremely important.
You mentioned 9/11 and 9/11 being representative of, a global conflict. You have a book that you authored, Learning the Lessons of Modern War, and it surveys conflicts across decades. Which lessons do you feel we, not just the United States, but many in the world, have just not learned yet?
Yeah, well, thanks for mentioning the book. I mean, and it's a sad commentary, but the book hasn't been out that long, and it's already missing a whole bunch of case studies, such as, and so maybe that's one. I mean, that's one overall lesson, which is you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you, and we haven't seen the end of war, and it's maybe a gloomy way of looking at the world, but I think it's an accurate way. My way of looking at the world is either you're at war or you're in an interwar period of undetermined duration.
Yeah, that is gloomy.
Well, but I think it is gloomy, but it hopefully is also sobering.
Yes.
I think particularly in the United States, particularly in the Western world, we would like to wish war away. We would like to believe, I think most Americans see peace as the natural order of things and wars as temporary diversions from that natural order. I think history tells us something different, and that war is a very human activity. We're still, fundamentally the same as our ancestors centuries or even millennia ago. And war is something that needs to be prepared for, and prepared for, among other reasons, to hope to prevent it. So, yeah, it is kind of gloomy, but, lesson number one is there's always the possibility of a war. And lesson 1A is the the way to increase the possibility of experiencing a war is not to prepare for it. It's a flip of the classic Latin phrase. If you want peace, prepare for war.
Yeah.
And I wish I had something more pleasant to say about that, but I think it's true, and it's probably more intuitive to more of the population now than it was 3, 5, 10 years ago. But we live in a world with countries and regimes that wish us ill, and we need to be prepared. Okay.
Do you think that perhaps some of this is a result of sometimes we want a boogeyman, so to say, or I mean, for the United States, and I know I'm approaching this very sophomorically, for lack of a better word, but again, sometimes it seems as if we can be driven by the need to identify, a boogeyman, whether it's in the form of an ideology like communism, it's a problem like the drug war, or it's terrorism. Do you think that plays into this mix somewhat?
Look, it's not sophomoric at all. I think it's a very widely held view. I would say my view is a little bit different. My view is that we, and again, I say as Americans, I mean, we're not unique. I would say, a lot of Western societies are similar, but let's stick to our own. We as Americans, that we tend to be optimists. We tend to think we can kind of muddle through things. And if anything, I think we are late. We are late to recognize dangers. I mean, I think, Churchill said, the Americans can be counted on to do the right thing after they've done everything else. And I think that's right. And whether we go back to, um, we could go back as far as you want in American history, but um, for but we talked about 9/11, right? The problem with 9/11 wasn't that we created Al Qaeda as a boogeyman and then went and rampaged through Afghanistan. It was that we didn't do enough early enough to deal with the threat that Al Qaeda posed to the United States until after 9/11. There were certainly efforts to deal with Osama bin Laden. I'm not disregarding that, but as a nation, we were asleep to that. I similarly think that there were multiple presidential administrations that earnestly sought to build a constructive relationship with Russia after Vladimir Putin rose to power. They all failed, right? And so I don't think it's in the case of Russia similar to Al Qaeda. I don't think it was a case of us turning Russia into a boogeyman. I think more it was a case of us indulging in some maybe over-optimistic assumptions about Russia and its leadership and its leadership's attitude towards the United States.
But this does leave us then vulnerable to manipulation, where someone wants to gain our favor and say, oh, I have a problem with fill in the blank, communist, terrorist, and it's not necessarily a true instance of that. They just may have an opposing party or an opposing segment of society, but they want to take sort of a iron-fisted approach to it, and they get support from us. I find that at times we can exploit it because of our own optimism and the willingness, wrong or right, to sort of be the policeman in the world. You mentioned again our optimism, and that we're not looking for boogeymen. And our country is founded upon the rule of law. I referenced the U.S. Constitution at the beginning. And yes, we've had our flaws over time, and over time we've evolved and done what we can, I think, to address the flaws in our governmental system. But the irony is we have the rule of law here at home, but we've engaged sometimes in debatable military operations. And again, not questioning it, but people have debated whether we should have engaged in one activity or a conflict or not. But all keeping that in mind, how does one maintain moral clarity and public trust in work that necessarily involves secrecy?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. I would say a couple things. First, we should realize that even among liberal democracies, the United States is a pretty transparent system. I mean, we are more transparent than the UK, for example. Our system of government, right? The system of checks and balances that we have forces us to be more transparent than just say a parliamentary system, right? So a fair amount of transparency is in our DNA. And so the problem there is, there are sometimes things that, for very good reasons, one would want to conceal. And here I'm not talking, you were talking about military operations and things like this, but when it comes to intelligence, for example, you can imagine types of capabilities or operations that cost a lot of money, are very perishable. Like if they were to be disclosed, an adversary could undertake countermeasures that would be fairly cheap, fairly quick, fairly simple. Those are the types of things you'd really want to keep secret, right? If only just to be a good steward of the taxpayers' dollars, that you'd like to be able to do that. And I think that's proven exceedingly difficult in our system. I mean, I think about various leaks over time that have undermined efforts like that. And again, that's quite apart from issues of morality,
yes.
Right? So just maintaining secrecy can be difficult. What I would say, though, to the broader question is, um, because of the transparency of our system, uh, decision makers should always keep in mind the possibility, maybe even the probability, that something that they hope to conceal is going to come to light, and how are they going to respond, or how would they respond in defense of that action should it come to light. And by the way, again, I think there are plenty of cases where something is kept secret that is completely morally defensible. The people talk about the New York Times test. How would you feel about it if it appeared on the front page of the New York Times, which in and of itself is a dated reference, because some people probably don't even know what a front page is. Others may not know what the New York Times is, aside from the NYT app,
Yes.
which includes Wordle. So I think that's a key part of it. My experience has been limited as it is, but my experience in government has been that by and large, leaders take those responsibilities very, very seriously. Kind of goes back to an earlier conversation. I mean, once you are in a position of authority, you take these things very seriously, and that includes things that could result in the loss of life, either American lives, foreign lives, the loss of a key capability, the expenditure of lots of money. There's no easy answers there, but by and large, the decision makers that I've been around have taken that very very seriously.
In terms of decision making, so practices that are linked to that. It's a chicken and egg conundrum from my vantage point. Do effective practices make a good decision maker, or do good decision makers create effective practices? And
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is sort of chicken and egg. What I would say is people trump practice. And the example, and look, having both would be great, right? But the example that I would provide has to do with the Reagan administration, and specifically the Reagan administration strategy that helped us win the Cold War. Really, it was the Reagan strategy against the Soviet Union. When it came to process, the Reagan White House, the Reagan NSC was a disaster area. I mean, it was, if you were process oriented or organization oriented, it'd be a case study in all the things not to do. I can't remember how many national security advisors Reagan went through, but it was a bunch. The policymaking process left a lot to be desired, and yet there were enough of the right people, and I would say in this case, beginning with the president, who thought strategically and came up with a coherent strategy for competing with the Soviet Union, and then implemented it through the remainder of Reagan's 2 terms. So that's just a good example of human capital.
yes,
Of people trumping process. And I'll also admit look, that's my philosophical bias anyway. Again, I think people are tremendously important. Process is important in its own way, but people really do reign supreme. And so it's, you could imagine, I don't know, imagine, Jimmy Carter getting reelected in 1980 and having a great process. He didn't actually have a great process either, but imagine if he had a great process with some of the advisors around him. He had some good advisors, some less so. You could imagine a very different outcome. So again, I think it's people that really trump process.
and speaking of the people and influencing the people in an organization and the ones that are going to be in the field, if you wouldn't mind commenting briefly the impact influence that, say, a particular organizational philosophy or an individual's vision for the organization a motto can have. As an example, one would see a lot of times, or still sees occasionally, in police departments, like on their squad cars, to serve and to protect. Or General Mattis giving instructions to Marines and say, if you can't remember anything else, do no harm, right? And how that trickles down. Comment on that.
Oh no, I think that crystallization of values, that level of vision, I think is tremendously important. I think that type of a direction is more important than, I've been down this path too, like the whole exercise where you come up with your vision statement and your mission statement, and that could just kind of become its own sort of cult, right? But that basic direction, I think is extremely important, and because I think, in any organization, in government, out of government, we're all sort of advisors. We're always advising someone. Often, sometimes it's formal, oftentimes it's informal. And so I think it's important and I certainly when I was in the Pentagon, I very much thought of myself as an advisor to the Secretary of Defense. And that forced me to think about, what are his priorities, and ultimately what are the president's priorities, and how can I help? So, and folks who've been the most difficult to help, and they'll go unnamed on this podcast, were people who didn't have that articulated vision, right? So without that sense of direction, how can I help? Hard for me to figure out how I can fit into that. But as you say, like, and Mattis is a good example of that. Like, well, with that basic guidance, okay, got it. Now I can move out and see how I can contribute to that.
What comes to mind thinking of, based on our intelligence threat assessments that come out annually? So we've identified countries as being adversaries: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Mm-hmm. But putting that descriptor aside, what comes to mind from any of them that you say we could actually learn from in terms of effective organizational practice?
Well, I think so. When I think about learning, I think about learning in a positive way. I also think about learning in a negative way, right? So no, but look, I think it's a really key point, right? So there's the type of learning that you say, like, oh, I want to emulate this, which I think was your kind of the intent of your question, right? So
no, not emulating. Again, it's an actual, although it's subjectively done, but as close to an objective realization that, well, there is this one thing they are doing well, and it is driven by this particular philosophy.
Yeah. No, what I was going to say was, you can learn from a positive standpoint. You can also learn from, like, don't ever do that.
Yes.
That's value. That's just as valuable. I by and large had really good bosses in my career. I've had some that are not so good. I learned from both types.
Yes.
And even if it's don't ever do what that person, what you saw that person do to their assistant, don't ever do that. That's extremely valuable, even if it was something that I wasn't going to do on my own anyway. Just good reinforcement. Look, what I would say is that Russia and China, and they're individual countries, different, but actually they have a fair amount in common in what I'm about to say. They really do think about national security in an integrated sort of way. Our system, as designed by the founders, is stovepiped. Our system was designed, to defend against tyranny, to promote liberty. That's why those are the values that I think are most deeply enshrined in our system. But that comes at a cost of inefficiency and even in some cases, ineffectiveness. The authoritarian states are built for much greater efficiency. Now, I'm not saying we're never going to out-authoritarian the authoritarians, so we shouldn't try. We need to be true to our values. And so what I would even say there is, look, a little bit better coordination and integration is not incompatible with being a liberal democracy. And there I would cite one of our closest allies, Australia. I mean, I think the Australian government does a very good job of integrating military, diplomatic, economic, various aspects of national security policy. They do a very good job of it. And now it's easier for them to do because of their size, their relatively small size, but more kind of integration in national security policy would be good. And it's not incompatible with being a liberal democracy.
Shifting gears and putting you a bit and your think tank in the limelight here. For the lay listener, what exactly does the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments do in practice?
Yeah, so I'll give you the clinical answer, right? The clinical answer is we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which that's a provision in the tax code. But what that means is we are a nonprofit that serves a public purpose. And really what our public purpose is to do research, analysis, and educate about national security issues. We help educate the American people. And I would just say, since you bring it up, so you can go to our website, which is csbaonline.org. If you go to just csba.org, I think that's the California Small Business Administration. They got to that domain name before us. So csbaonline.org. All of our publications are there. They're free for download. I would urge your listeners to read about what we do. So we are focused on national security policy and strategy, capabilities and concepts, and budgets and resources. And we educate the public. We also educate policymakers, including legislators and their staffs. I think one of the things that I didn't fully appreciate, I will confess, in my career up till the time I joined CSBA was what an information poor environment that members of Congress and their staffs exist in. Now, in a way, it's information rich. There's like a lot of data, like we talked about. There's a lot of stuff that's out there. But members and their staffs, I think, are justifiably skeptical of a lot of the information that they have presented to them on silver platters, because they realize that more often than not, the people that are doing that are doing it with their own sort of agenda and their own assumptions. And members and their staffs, sensibly enough, would like to make up their own minds. So we help do that. We help lead conversations on national security. I mean, lead conversations in terms of oftentimes we have less to say about what's happening right now and more on the things we need to think about in the next year or 5 years or so.
With that in mind, after Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, military spending is the largest U.S. expenditure of the overall government budget. Our allies like Canada, the UK, France, Japan, they've spent on average 2 to 6% annually for the last 20 years of total government expenditures on defense. Whereas here in the U.S., we're spending over 10% of our total government expenditures on national defense. So to me, this raises the question, are we perhaps overspending or simply spending differently? I mean, it's obviously we're spending differently, but again, are we prioritizing differently? Is the gap justified by the geopolitical climate, or has it become a reflexive habit of policy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would start by, well, the way you framed it, which is a legitimate way of framing it, has to do with government expenditure. And I think Americans can disagree, and actually do disagree, over, just how much the government should be spending and for what. And I think in many cases, you can have a very productive debate over how much the government should spend on entitlements, social spending. Those are all very meritorious debates. Where there is no debate is over the fact that there is no substitute for government spending on defense. Meaning, if the government doesn't spend on defense, it's not as if private industry is going to do that, right? And in fact, one of the most sacred duties of the U.S. government, executive and legislative branches, is to provide for the common defense. It's a core mission of the government. So I think what you say is true when it comes to government spending. I would also point out, though, that when it comes to defense spending, right now we're spending just around or just north of 3% of gross national product.
Yeah, but when it comes to the total allocation, the budget.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's but again, that says something about defense, but it also says more about, as you say, social spending, and kind of how what's discretionary, what's not discretionary, right? So when I tend to think about it, and so this also gets to your point about allies, right? Allies. Many European countries have more ornate social spending systems than we do. So you look at defense spending against that. Okay, it looks sort of meager. That's why I like to look at like for like. So I would look at levels of GNP, and what's going on now. I'd say two things. So I'll say three things actually. So first, what we are spending in terms of GNP is basically on par with where we were during the peace dividend of the Clinton years, after the end of the Cold War. And yet the world that we live in today, I think, is much more dangerous than that era. If we could go back to that era, that'd be great, but I don't think we're going to. So if I look at what we're spending on defense relative to what we spent during the Cold War, it's a fraction of that. If I look at what our allies are spending, again, and I think about it in terms of GNP, most of our allies are increasing their defense spending in an absolute sense. And look, the Trump administration has told our allies, that we expect them to get up to 5% of GNP on defense. That's our NATO allies. I believe it's been said to our allies in Asia. I guess what I would say is, if the United States is a founding member of NATO, and we're telling all the other NATO allies to get to 5%, we should probably get to 5% as well.
Well, one of the reasons I focused on as a percentage of government expenditure, again, this is the allowance, my parents gave me, so how am I going to spend the allowance, right? It just gave me a different way of looking at how we prioritize as a government. I agree with you completely. If we look at it from the GDP standpoint, well, yeah, we're pretty much on par with others, and they are with us. I just found it somewhat telling that there was a difference when it came to looking at the data based on what a government spends as a percentage of their actual government budget. And then what struck me even more was, and the information I'm getting from for our listeners' benefit, was from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which many folks have referenced, including your own think tank. And I was kind of struck by how China's defense spending, again, using the data of total government expenditures, that it's steadily declined since 2000 from 11% to about 5%. Do you think this is reflecting some kind of efficiency or fiscal constraints, or a broader shift toward long-term state-building investments?
No, I think it is an artifact of what has been a rapidly growing Chinese economy, right? So numerator, denominator, right? So as the size of the Chinese economy has grown and grown pretty markedly, then the share of total expenditures on defense has gone down just because the overall economy has been going up. Chinese defense spending has been increasing in an absolute sense,
Based on GDP, right?
Or just absolute. I
Okay.
mean, like if you want to think about absolute, and it's difficult to do with China because
Yes.
they conceal a bunch of information, they lie about other information, they have some information in some places, and then there's a whole issue of purchasing power parity, the exchange rate. But if you want to estimate the size of Chinese defense expenditure, it's been growing. It's been growing pretty markedly, and it's getting up to somewhere close to what the U.S. is spending. I don't want to argue how close, but it's getting close. And if you don't, I'm not saying you don't believe me, but if you need more convincing, just take a look at the output of Chinese defense spending in
Yes.
terms of modernization. The Chinese just christened their newest aircraft carrier just earlier this week or last week. They're pumping out ships. They are pumping out intercontinental ballistic missiles. They're undertaking kind of the biggest nuclear buildup going on this planet right now. They've invested in creating artificial features in the South China Sea. They're buying lots of stuff. And so that tells me, as somebody who nominally has a degree in international economics, that they're spending a lot of money.
Okay.
Right? And so they're spending a lot of money, and they're spending a lot of money to a purpose. Right? I mean, they're spending a lot of money elsewhere, but they're spending a lot of money towards a military purpose. So I think and they're able to bear that burden because the Chinese economy has been growing. Now, should that growth, and I think that growth is slowing down, should it continue to slow down, well, then it will become a greater burden, right? But as the Chinese economy has grown, that burden has shrunk. Similarly, look, the United States could, if the U.S. economy were to grow, let's just say high single figures, we could afford to spend much more on defense, and yet the defense burden would go down, right? Because the
Understood.
numerator denominator, the denominator keeps growing.
Okay. You may be going out on a limb with this question, or not. But do you think China's focus on national defense spending is just to be a competitor, to be on par with us, or it's actually aggressively inclined, or it may actually be preemptively defensive in nature? They are actually, they see us as a threat, and they're just responding to how we perceive them as a threat. It's like going back and forth at this point.
Yeah, look, I think and it doesn't have to be just one of those things, right? And I think
Yes.
the reality is it's a mixture of things. So some of the things that China is doing are, when it comes to defense and defense expenditure, really are about status. And I don't, when I say status, I'm not minimizing that. I think
Yes.
status is extremely important. But they are benchmarking what the United States is capable of doing. The United States as the most powerful country, the most powerful military, and they are very consciously benchmarking and seeking to acquire those capabilities for themselves, because a modern military is A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and they're trying to acquire those capabilities. So some of it has to do with looking at the U.S., and I'm not saying in a hostile way, but we are the top dog, and China wants to be at least on par, maybe the top dog, maybe ahead of us. They're benchmarking, so that's part of it. Another part of it has to do with the Chinese Communist Party's enunciated objectives, and those objectives include, they would say reunification. I would say unification or conquest of Taiwan. And Xi Jinping has told his military to be ready to take Taiwan in 2027. Now, that, to my mind, isn't necessarily a ticking clock, and he hasn't already decided 2 years in advance or 5 years in advance when he first said it, that's what he's going to do. But that is driving a good part of Chinese military modernization. It's not just a benchmark. It's what do we need to be able to conquer, to coerce Taiwan. And then there's another element of it too that is about, I will say, interaction with the United States. So again, you got this benchmark. So like the benchmarking is, hey, the United States has nuclear powered aircraft carriers. Yeah, guess what? The Chinese are building nuclear powered aircraft carriers, right? That's a benchmark. The United States is moving into sixth generation combat aircraft. Guess what? The Chinese are moving into sixth generation combat aircraft. But that third part about interaction is the Chinese are acquiring systems that are tailor-made to defeat particular parts of the U.S. military. So China is not just acquiring aircraft carriers, but it's acquiring a whole suite of capabilities aimed figuratively and literally at U.S. aircraft carriers. So there is a sense where they are very purposefully trying to defeat the U.S. military. I think all those three things are going on at the same time. So yeah, just on that naval part, right? They're both investing in aircraft carriers, and they're investing a lot in the means to defeat aircraft carriers.
Your mission, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments mission, focuses heavily on future U.S. defense strategy, and much of it has centered on China. And do you think there's a risk of confirmation bias, whether it involves China or Russia or whatnot? In your line of work, how do you as an organization ensure that you're not engaging in confirmation bias?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. And I think one always has to be concerned about that. In the case of China, however, I would say, and here I'll personalize it. I won't talk about the organization, but just I'll personalize it. Like, I think with China, too often I feel like I've been the voice crying out in the wilderness. It's not like confirmation bias. It's that a number of the challenges that we face today are challenges that were visible, say, going back to the late 1990s, but that the system hasn't really addressed. So, in my case, it's literally over a quarter century calling attention to some of our vulnerabilities and some of the challenges we're facing relative to China. And not that nothing has happened, but probably too little and not as timely a manner as I would have hoped. So from that perspective, that's another sort of a depressing part of my job. It's not stoking an arms race. It's not being listened to as much as one would hope. I just think that the system that we have, and this is our democratic system, is not is not primed for rapid action. Again, I go back to the Churchill quote of we'll do the right thing after we've expended all the other options. I think that is unfortunately and fortunately that's just the way our system is constructed. But look, more broadly, one of the things that, and here I will say we as opposed to me, we focus heavily on is really trying to understand how the Chinese think, how the Chinese military thinks, how the Chinese Communist Party thinks. And it's not exactly the way that we think. And so we try to, and nor should it be, right? So we really try to understand the way Chinese decision makers make strategy, same with Russian decision makers, on their own terms. And I think that's a very valuable way to guard against confirmation bias.
Speaking of China directly, and for purposes of the question, treating it as a not only an adversary but potential threat, do you think we give too many of our corporate citizens, meaning our Fortune 500 companies, too much of a free hand because of their investments in China, their presence there? And should we perhaps not place more limitations on them because, in one sense, they are helping fuel or resource our adversary?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. A good Marxist would know the quote, that capitalism will sell the noose that communism will use to hang it, and there is that tendency, and so I do think there's a very strong case to be made for thinking about business investments through a national security lens. I also think, by and large, a lot of companies that invest in China, well, they wind up doing so on terms that are more favorable to China than those companies. Many of them wind up regretting it. That is something that is of concern to me. I think at least a partial decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies makes a lot of sense. And by the way, it's going on both sides. I mean, some of it's has been going on across administrations on the U.S. side. It's also been going on the Chinese side as well, for all sorts of reasons. And it's going on for national security reasons. It also goes going on for economic reasons. I mean, as China develops the terms of trade shift, and it's it can be less attractive to do business in China, and say more attractive in Vietnam or other places. Again, depending on the business. But yeah, I think we need to pay very close attention to that.
So, do you think the U.S. gives enough weight to the perspectives of our neighbors within the Western Hemisphere, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, when it's defining it's the defense strategy for the states? Or is the U.S. collaborating effectively within the Western Hemisphere to balance global priorities?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, in my experience, all too often, the United States, we have felt inhibited in dealing with our neighbors in Central and South America and to the north in Canada. Mexico is a good example of that. Mexico, in recent decades, has had a troubled history, right? Troubled history with narco-terrorism, with a whole bunch of issues. And I've often thought that if Mexico were located somewhere else, let's just say like in Central Asia, the United States would freely deploy a whole bunch of tools to help that country deal with narco-terrorism, secure its borders, do a whole bunch of things like that. But because we're neighbors and because of America's history with Mexico and Mexico's history with the United States, we're all too often inhibited. And the cry of Yankee imperialism comes too easily to the lips of too many Central and South American governments. And on our side, we wind up being very very inhibited. Now, sometimes that can be good. Like I think the United States played a crucially important role in helping the government of Colombia defeat the FARC. But it was a crucial role, but it was very much a low key, behind the scenes, backseat role. And there was a case where we didn't try to do too much. We worked very closely with our Colombian allies. But in many other cases, I've seen that collaboration just be inhibited by our common history, and it's a shame.
And we've also made mistakes in the region, like, with Chile, so to say.
Yeah, that's part of that history.
Yeah.
That's right.
Moving towards emerging challenges and geopolitical adversaries aside, what challenges do you see the Department of Defense facing?
Well, I will give you one that doesn't get a lot of attention, so maybe it'll be of interest to your listeners, but it's also kind of in keeping with what we've talked about before, which is, I think, a huge challenge that the Department of Defense faces today and will face in the future has to do with building intellectual capital. Again, back to the centrality of people. Building intellectual capital to suit the world of today, and whether that's regional expertise, whether it's expertise in emerging technologies, that's a huge challenge. Again, the Pentagon that I served in was populated by just some amazing public servants, and I like the term public servant better than civil servant. I like the Commonwealth term as opposed to the U.S. term, because it really puts front and center what it's all about. It's about public service, right? You're not serving civilization; you're serving the public. And we had an outstanding group of public servants. Hiring freezes, government shutdowns, retirements have really winnowed down that expertise. And so I think rebuilding that expertise is going to be a multi-year, maybe even multi-decade enterprise.
Are there any particular misconceptions in the media or public discourse about national defense that you'd like to address?
Oh my gosh, how much time do we have? There's so much. Well, look, let me just touch on one. And again, this is one that I am aware of, on almost a daily basis in my job, but I wasn't nearly as aware of before I came to this job. And it has to do with the relationship of between government and private industry. When the United States did amazing things in the early Cold War, we talked about the Atlas missile program. You could think about the Apollo program. You could think about any number of things. Those worked because government and industry worked hand in glove, and there was a lot of trust. And unfortunately, too often these days, government and industry just think about things very differently. We have too many people in government who don't understand the basics of our free enterprise system. They don't understand the basics of supply and demand. And we have folks in industry, particularly in some of the newer defense startups and tech startups, that don't understand the realities of dealing with the U.S. government. And those realities include, the budget cycle. They include, the fact we're just coming out of a shutdown, all the things that obtain when you're dealing with the government that you don't have to deal with when you're just dealing with private customers. So I think building greater trust and understanding across that divide between government and industry really is central to our effectiveness going forward.
And that kind of connects a bit or relates to what you were saying before about building intellectual capital.
Yeah.
True to the podcast name, could you share a bit of Lagniappe an unexpected insight, habit, or lesson that's helped you navigate uncertainty, complexity throughout this time? Or
Yeah, that's a tall order, right? But
yeah,
let me say,
I tend to demand a lot of people.
yeah, no, well, that's how you get good out of people is demand excellence. No, what I would say is the things that I have regretted most in terms of decisions, not in terms of career choices, because
Yes.
by and large, I don't regret anything I've done when it comes to career choices. But when it comes to decision making in an environment of uncertainty and complexity, the things that I regret the most are instances where I didn't act sooner or act more strongly or more forcefully.
Hmm.
Um, I don't have regrets about being the boy who cried wolf, right? I don't have those regrets. The regrets are if I had just spoken out a little bit louder, a little bit earlier, maybe it would have made a difference. Now, maybe it wouldn't have, but I think if you do it and then you live with the consequences, then you have the satisfaction of at least, hey, I did it. And maybe it didn't work out. Maybe I wasn't listened to, but at least I did it. So the times, and again, there haven't been a huge number, but I can think of some where I wish I had been a little bit louder, a little bit more vociferous, maybe shaking my boss by the shoulders, figuratively, not literally. Those are my regrets. So kind of going back to what I said earlier, we don't live in Stalin's Russia. What's the worst thing that's going to happen to you? And usually the worst thing is something that has to do with a bruised ego. At the worst, maybe it's losing a job. Okay, but you lose a job and you get another job, and I don't your ego will recover. But the things that you believe you should do and don't do, those are the things you've got to live with for the rest of your life.
Very true. On the more personal side, and I always like to, you get to know someone by eating what they eat, and listening to their music, reading some of the literature they enjoy. Anything that you'd like to share with the audience, a favorite piece of literature or whatnot?
Oh my gosh. Again, we could go on for so long
Yeah.
on this. I believe I love literature. I love history. I just think, there's so much to be learned from reading autobiographies or biographies, right? I think, I'm always fascinated in, a person's journey and their thinking. So, Ulysses S. Grant's autobiography is really one of the great autobiographies of all time. He didn't want to write it. He wrote it while he was dying so that his family could have money after he passed, which is a far better way to write an autobiography than, to get elected president or get the Nobel Peace Prize or something like that. And so the autobiographies are biographies of leaders. So I mentioned Grant's autobiography, but there's also the Ron Chernow biography of Grant. That's just a fantastic book. I would offer those up among worthwhile things to read. If you want to learn about leadership, if you want to learn about decision making, read things that decision makers have actually written about, how they grappled with different choices that they had to make.
Well, speaking of decision makers and leaders and their writings, Churchill was quite a prolific author and a historian. But that's a topic for another time. Dr. Mahnken, man, thank you for your time, sharing your insights, as well as your service. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on Brungart Law's Lagniappe, where we provide a little extra perspective because the devil is always in the details. Please join us again next week and invite others to follow along. Also, please give us your feedback and suggestions via the link. Dr. Mahnken, again, gratitude.
My pleasure. Glad to be with you.